From Illinois Soul, this is Dialogue. I'm Kennedy Vincent. Dialogue is an exchange about culture, straight from the soul. You can catch us on Saturday mornings at 11 and Tuesdays at 7 p.m. on Illinois Soul. Today, you're going to be hearing a conversation from Illinois Public Media's The 21st Show. Brian Mackey hosts a conversation about a remarkable run of stories published by and in cooperation with the Invisible Institute. That's the name of the nonprofit news organization based on the south side of Chicago. The conversation takes a deep dive about the Invisible Institute investigations. First, you're going to hear from Missing in Chicago. That's the name of a years-long investigation into hundreds of thousands of missing persons cases in the city. It's a problem that disproportionately affects Black Chicagoans, and in particular, Black women and girls. And behind every number and every case, there's a human story. Here's a small clip from the project.
Well, what I want everybody to remember about her is her energy, her smile. And she had that type of spirit where you sit down and just kick it and just shoot the breeze and just talk about anything.
It's a bond between a mother and a daughter. Your child is missing. It's nothing good. You know, you be thinking, what is this, where they at? Every moment you thinking, where are they, where are they, where are they?
I remember this one particular day, her car broke down. She lost her job all in the same day. And it was like everything just came at her all at once.
Missing in Chicago is the work of a collaboration between the Invisible Institute, where Trina Reynolds Tyler is a data director, and City Bureau, where Sarah Conway is senior reporter and special projects manager. Last month, they were honored with the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting. We'll now tune in to the conversation with The 21st Show.
I wanted to begin by asking each of you to tell us a bit about your roles in this work and what inspired you to investigate this issue. Trina, I'd like to begin with you.
So this project comes out of Beneath the Surface, a machine learning and narrative justice project that I lead that investigates or interrogates the intersections between gender-based violence and policing. We parsed through police misconduct records from the year 2011 to 2015, identified 54 allegations of misconduct related to missing persons, but it was an issue I was already quite interested in when I was training as a data scientist at the Human Rights Data Analysis Group in San Francisco. The first document I ever scraped was a FOIA related to missing persons cases. And so once we got those initial findings of those police, those allegations of misconduct, I reached out to Sarah Conway maybe in June 2021. We sat at Build Coffee, and I told her about my dream of, going deep into this issue in a way that really focused on survivors, on the stories of people in connection to systems, institutions of accountability.
Sarah, can you take it from there? What was that conversation like? What was your introduction to this work like from your perspective?
Well, I had been for a very long time interested in doing stories and journalism that really centered the experience of communities. I think both Trina and I, we found a connection with one another and a similar heart to doing investigative reporting that is really rooted in connecting with impacted families, understanding how they have moved throughout the criminal justice system, and in this case with missing persons, specifically police. I had been drawn to, Trina's work with Beneath the Surface and Invisible Institute's mission because I had seen through my own reporting on women in Illinois prisons, pregnant folks who are at Cook County Jail, how much gender influences how you move throughout carceral systems. And so when we connected, we were both extremely curious about how this issue of missing persons impacted Black Chicagoans and specifically Black girls and women in the city.
So Sarah, as you begin reporting on this, what what these missing person cases in particular. I wonder what stood out to you. What were some of the early findings that I'm sure there were, many heartbreaking stories you came across, but talk about some of the early findings you had.
So it's really interesting. I think that the project, what is really groundbreaking about it is that we merged narrative justice with data science. Trina had brought up the 54 allegations of misconduct around missing persons. When we went in and coded those and looked at, what exactly was there, we pretty quickly saw that police were denying and delaying families reporting their loved ones missing. We also saw that police had claimed that people had returned home when they hadn't. And we saw a pattern of abusive language and behavior from police officers with families who felt that they were being discriminated against because their loved one was Black. And so that initial data work, showed up when we started connecting with families. It really mirrored what families were telling us. And so we knew that from the misconduct complaints, that we needed to talk to families. And then what families told us often reflected what were in those initial complaints.
I think what was most shocking, just piggybacking off of Trina speaking, was that, law enforcement had prematurely closed missing persons cases, naming that this person had been located and they were safe and that they were not a victim or offender of a crime, when in fact they had not been located and they were a victim of a crime. Desiree Robinson, for example, in 2016, 16-year-old girl who was being sex trafficked at the time that the detective wrote in a report that she had been located and was safe. 4 days later, on Christmas Eve, she was found murdered. And so it really called to question whether Chicago police were looking for her in the first place and what kinds of actions law enforcement are taking to find people and what kinds of accountability systems exist when they obscure information, when they lie in their reports.
I want to take a moment to remind listeners you are currently listening to Dialogue on Illinois Soul. Right now, you're tuning into a conversation from Illinois Public Media's The 21st Show. The host, Brian Mackey, is speaking with the Invisible Institute from the South Side of Chicago. He's speaking about the Pulitzer Prize-winning series, Missing in Chicago. A huge portion of Chicago's missing people have been young Black women and girls, and they're speaking about what authorities failed to do about that. This work was in collaboration between Trina Reynolds Tyler and Sarah Conway, who joined Brian Mackey to speak about this project.
In the story, it talks about how the fact that this was one of the last paper records in the Chicago Police Department. There were so many cases that were incorrectly coded. I don't remember the exact figure, but it was well north of 99% where there was no violence involved. Is how they were, or it wasn't sort of like a person came to harm. When clearly, as you said, a lot of these people had been murdered or had never returned home. How do you actually take these paper records, all this data that you had scraped or obtained through other means, Trina, and you mentioned machine learning, artificial intelligence is a term that gets thrown around here. Walk us through how you go from that to actual, coming up with stories out of this.
Right. So we have a repository of police misconduct records in Illinois because of the Calvin versus City of Chicago lawsuit, which deemed that all records related to police misconduct are public information. And what we felt was important was to parse through that data, because I think a lot of times when we're talking about policing, we think about the sensationalized things. We think about someone getting shot 16 times, you know, some of the a church going social worker, Angela Young, who experienced a search warrant of her home while she was naked. We're not always thinking about the everyday experiences of people. And so it was really important that we started with police misconduct records, because we're looking at narratives that connect people across space and time, even though they've never met, to discuss or corroborate or make up anything. They're just simply telling their same story at the hands of different officers. Now, speeding forward into diving into missing persons cases, we introduce another couple data sets. We look at the missing persons data from Chicago Police. We look at the Cook County Medical Examiner's death data. Um, we look at the 911 calls that are made. You know, we're looking at the sheriff's missing persons project data, and we're seeing the names of people, and we're also looking at, you know, media reports that ultimately tell us what really happened to them. And for example, you know, when we're looking at the sheriff's office, they had this, you know, in the end of 2022, they were like, oh, we finally reunited this woman's body with her daughter. It's been 11 years that this case has been open, but the sheriff's office knew, based on their underlying records, that Chicago police had lied when, you know, Chicago police said in an underlying report that this woman was located safe, even though at the time she was a Jane Doe in the morgue in 2014. And so it was really important for us to pull together lots of different data sets, pieces of information to see how they lined up with each other in order to really identify the gaps there in the case of missing persons, you know, what we see as underlying issues, crimes related to it in the data, homicide, sexual assault, and kidnapping. But as you noticed, as you mentioned earlier, many of these cases are not labeled as relating to the actual crimes that occurred when the missing person, or the crimes that were identified when the missing person was found.
Sarah,
This is Sarah
yeah, go
from
ahead.
one of the things that we found when we dug into over 20 years of Chicago Police Department missing persons data is that there were only, out of the more than 300,000 cases that existed, approximately, there were only 300 missing persons cases that had been relabeled as criminally related to, crimes like homicide, sexual assault, and kidnapping. We found that there were only 10 homicides associated with missing persons cases in CPD's data. But when we went through using, medical examiner data, autopsy reports, homicide data, and news reports, we were able to identify as reporters 11 additional homicides that were labeled as not criminal in nature, even though they were actually associated with a homicide case in CPD's data. And I think that kind of points to that the Chicago Police Department, their missing persons data as it exists right now obscures some really complex issues around crime and violence in the city and how they're associated, specifically when we're talking about gender-based violence and how it manifests in the city for Black women and girls who we know through Dorothy Tucker's reporting make up 1 in 3 crime victims in the city.
When they're a much smaller percentage of the population overall. Absolutely. So I wonder, so we're coming to the end of our time together. There's so much more to get into here, and we'll have a link to your work on our website if people want to read more. But what has been the response from the city in terms of accountability? Have there been changes or responses? I noticed the Chicago Police Department seemed to not be very interested in talking with you for this reporting. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so, throughout our reporting, we reached out to Chicago Police more than a handful of times, and they didn't really get back to us until really late in the game. And they said, like, we investigate cases equally across race, sex, zip code, but that was nearly impossible for them to even know themselves, because when we look at their officer arrival data between for I think between 2017 and 2021, they're missing much of their response time data, so they can't even evaluate themselves. But as far as like elected official level we have gotten a nice response at the state level. The Illinois Task Force for Missing and Murdered Chicago Women and Girls have they had us present at their task force. They've spoken to us quite a lot about our findings. Alderwoman Stephanie Coleman introduced a resolution in order to get a hearing on the issue at the Public Safety Committee level of City Council. And the Office of the Inspector General has identified understanding CPD's competence around missing persons as a potential project in the year 2024. So we've gotten a lot of elected official, response as well. But as on the community level, folks like Coco, folks like Move, families, literal sources that we spoke to, they have felt deeply impacted by our reporting and have described, this reporting giving them space and room to talk more about what happened to their loved ones because they had lost faith in the media and the institution, our government in general after what occurred to their loved one.
I think that there's been some healthy skepticism from families about what will come from this, but there is an openness when we talk to sources who are in the story that have a level of optimism that, the city and the state is going to act on this issue. And though they can't bring back their loved ones, that there could be some common sense improvements, like, for instance, digitizing CPD's missing persons form, the last paper-based form that they have, to save lives in the future.
You're currently listening to Dialogue. Stay with us after this short break on Illinois Soul. From Illinois Soul, this is Dialogue. I'm Kennedy Vincent. Dialogue is an exchange about culture, straight from the soul. You can catch us on Saturday mornings at 11 and Tuesdays at 7 p.m. on Illinois Soul. You're currently tuning in to a conversation from Illinois Public Media's The 21st Show. They're speaking with the Invisible Institute located in Chicago. Right now, they're going to be exploring a conversation about their podcast, You Didn't See Nothing. It's part true crime investigation of a 1997 hate crime and the aftermath.
My name is Johannes LaCour, and lately I've been talking to a lot of people from my past.
What's up, brother?
I got a bottle, I got some chicken. You said bring a joint, so I brought some herbals. I've been talking about who I was in my 20s.
There's a lot that I don't know about you.
I mean, we all got complexities, but I definitely think that you're probably more complex than most.
And I've been talking about a thing that happened in 1997.
Just last week in Chicago, a 13-year-old boy riding his bike was brutally attacked for no other reason but the color of his skin.
I didn't know Leonard Clark, but he could have been my little brother. I was angry as hell. And then, almost overnight, news stories turned to racial reconciliation and forgiveness.
Well, let's forget about what happened to Leonard Clark. That's old news. Let's go to this racial healing baloney.
Never in the history of criminal justice in Chicago have victims and the accused victimizers come together to repent and forgive each other. Never.
This podcast is about how that happened.
A witness linked to Leonard Clark murdered. Another one is missing.
I guess what happened was the Chicago way.
White folks know they can buy us by the pound. They know that.
And this podcast is about how it changed my life. Memory is a motherfucker. Environment is a motherfucker, man. I spent most of the last decade locked up on federal drug charges. And from those TV rooms in prison, it seemed like every other week it's another black person dying at the hands of white folks. Every time, I thought of Leonard Clark.
You Didn't See Nothing is available on wherever you get your podcasts. Last month, it earned 2 of the most prestigious awards in journalism, the Pulitzer Prize for Audio and a Peabody Award. As we heard, it's the work of Johannes LaCour. In addition to being a storyteller, he's an artist and designer of ultra-luxury leather goods. And now we'll tune into this conversation with the 21st Show.
What motivated you to revisit this 1997 Leonard Clark case for this podcast?
Well, it was an important story. Obviously, it stayed with me. And it stayed with me primarily because it was just unresolved and it was still untold and it was still happening, right? Like you heard in the trailer, like I'm watching Black men, women, and children be beaten and worse by police and white citizens for years while I'm in prison. And we've been watching it happen. And we only watched we've only seen the stories that have been shown to us. And I knew that this was a story that we hadn't seen when I saw Trayvon Martin, rest in peace, murdered. I thought of Lenard Clark, who, thank God, survived. But it made me think of Lenard Clark because to me, that was like the Trayvon Martin case of Chicago prior to social media, minus the outcome that was so tragic. We still have Lenard. And that was it was a story that needed to be told and had gone untold for too long.
And maybe for people who might be listening now who weren't around back then or following the news back then, it was huge news. Like you had Bill Clinton in your trailer there talking about it. This was a 13-year-old who, with a buddy, they went to fill up their tires because the air was free in the white neighborhood of Bridgeport, not where they lived, and they're savagely beaten. How did you first come to get interested in this case, other than just as you were actually started writing about it at the time, not just following it in the news like so many of us did?
Oh, well, the morning after it happened, or the morning it made the papers, my brother Rasan Gordon, who's gone on to become an amazing attorney, also from South Side of Chicago, he called me that morning like, bro, they just left a 13-year-old for dead in a coma, might not live in Bridgeport. And so, when he told me it happened in Bridgeport, we realized he was beaten by a mob of Italians much older than him. It was triggering, and so, being a 20-something in Chicago, our immediate reaction was an eye for an eye. We wanted a pound of flesh. That just wasn't gonna happen though. A car full of black 20-somethings riding through this all-white racist sundown of a town neighborhood. So that's when, my focus shifted to writing to do something about it. And, it was the things I found and things I started discovering, they kept me hooked because now it wasn't just so much about a crime. It wasn't just about this crime against this little boy. It was a crime against justice and truth. I want to point out the fact that, what reminds me a lot, what I think of when I'm listening to Sarah and Trina discuss their work, none of it. We don't have to do this work if police do theirs, right? Public safety and policing ain't working if the people don't feel safe, and if police aren't handling their business on the front end, journalists don't have to come around and clean up the narratives to show the public what's actually going on. So between police covering their own behinds because they don't want to be exposed for not caring enough about missing black women and girls in Chicago, to police being connected to would-be murderers and racists in a neighborhood like Bridgeport, trying to cover up those connections and cover up 40s Italian mob connected Bridgeport residents. If they say what happened, there's no questions around what really happened to Lenard Clark, who really did it, if the police are on their job. So, to a large degree, we are doing the work that the police should have long done.
One of the remarkable things about this story when it's happening in 1997 is, you described your outrage, your pain at this, that's so widespread. And yet there's the story kind of turns to this reconciliation, even among black community leaders at the time, church leaders. Talk about that and, how you perceive that in the moment and what you uncovered about that in your investigation nowadays.
Right. So in the moment, it was disgusting and it's still disgusting. But in the moment, it was just, I'm there while it's happening. I'm watching the effects on the case. And so, but again, if police do their job and make the public aware of who committed these crimes, black so-called activists and leaders don't have the opportunity, or should I say, all right, so let me rewind for listeners who don't understand. Lenard Clark is beaten savagely by a mob of what I believe was probably at least 6 young Bridgeport men with mob connections. 3 are charged, and those 3 that the ringleader was a kid with mob ties that go back to Al Capone. His father was a mob guy with ties that went back to Capone, and so they actually have connections and relationships with police officers. So at the first narrative, there's this question, and so what their power also enables them to do is recruit, Black folks who have some power themselves or some influence at least in the community. When it first happens, folks are outraged. You got Black people marching and protesting and marching through Bridgeport, and they angry as hell. And then then you start noticing in days, some of the same people leading these protests and marches are now suggesting that we forgive and forget, and that maybe it wasn't even them, and that we need to be thinking about racial healing. And it's like, wait a minute, where did this shift come from, right? Was something happened here? You don't turn day to night without a sun going down somewhere. What happened? And so, my investigation, I discovered that from sources that I couldn't name at the time, because they wanted to be off the record because they were in fear of their own safety, that the mob family connected to the lead attacker was paying off these Black folks in the community, right? And so they started changing tune, and they started rationalizing to themselves like, well, if these boys go to prison, all right, they're in prison, but what do we have? What does that really do for Leonard? But if we can get some money, we can do something in our neighborhoods, then we can get some more people some jobs, and now it's a win. Which I want to just point out is just another, tragic nuance of being Black in America, because it does force you to ask, what does an arrest and a conviction really mean? It's not bringing, when it gets you closer to justice. It's the feel of justice. But if because George Zimmerman is still walking, so we're angry as hell. But if he goes to prison, it doesn't bring Trayvon back. And so that was the viewpoint, or at least a rationalization of these Black folks who started kind of kowtowing and selling out and buying in to the program.
Johannes, was this always going to be a memoir too, this project?
No, it wasn't. Initially, it was just going to be a long-form journalism piece, kind of revisiting the story, and we knew it was going to tell it was going to be a Chicago story, right? It was going to be a period piece about something that just about a story that had gone untold. And the Invisible Institute audio team, which I just want to give a huge shout out: Sarah Geis, Bill Healy, Rissa Apentaku, and Dana Brozos Kelleher. They had just come off of a hugely successful podcast called Somebody, for which they were nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. And so they've gotten a formula. They put together this amazing audio team, and they discovered how to kill podcasts, and kill it in a good way. Obviously.
Yeah, I got you.
And it was Jamie Calvin, who founded the Invisible Institute, who also just has an amazing eye for stories and structural components of stories, who suggested that this piece also be part memoir. And because it was what was really interesting to him, and obviously proved to be interesting to a lot of folks, was the view of someone who'd been incredibly concerned about this story 25 years ago, and then that view, how much it's changed or been altered 25 years later after being removed from society for 10 years. And I will say, this kind of is partly an answer to your previous question. All of this time later, my thoughts of, at the time when Black men and women were selling Leonard Clark out and, taking these 30 pieces of silver to be quiet, I was enraged. And as far as I was concerned, they were sellouts and coons, and they were just as bad as the Italians who who nearly killed Leonard. Looking back, I realized that, they can't be absolved of responsibility and complicity, but they were victims themselves of a system that, renders you, so helpless and so destitute that those 30 pieces of silver are life changing. That's not to defend them. That's not to excuse it. Because shame on them, but it offers a different explanation.
Just a couple of minutes left in our time together. I wonder what sort of reaction you've gotten from people in your life, in your communities, about this work.
It's just never-ending praise, which I appreciate. It's humbling. I'm thankful. I thank God every morning that this story was able to reach people. I think that it's also, I think that the fact that, that a Peabody and a Pulitzer have been awarded to the work of somebody coming from prison has been eye-opening for folks. I think that, what we're doing at the Invisible Institute is highlighting not only the stories that ain't been told, but who should be telling them. So it's been amazing. It's been an amazing flood of praise and thanks for sharing some history that otherwise would have gone covered.
Just about a minute. I've got to ask, since we have that time, you also design sneakers, luxury bags. This is a skill I understand you picked up in prison, working with leather. Do those two interests of yours relate, storytelling, designing?
Absolutely, because, I'm telling a story with my shoes. My lead shoe is I picked up leatherwork in prison, and after I came home, I found a Chicago school of shoemaking and learned how to make shoes, primarily gym shoes, which we call them in Chicago, sneakers. And my flagship shoe, my signature shoe, if you will, is called the Redemption. I'm trying to tell stories with my designs and kind of speak on how I see the world through design. So it's abstract, but they're very much connected, and appreciate it. And your people can find it at yjlshop.com. Shameless plug real quick.
It's all right. Johannes LaCour is a writer with the Invisible Institute. The podcast is called You Didn't See Nothing, as we heard, Peabody Award, Pulitzer Prize. It's a really good listen. Johannes, thank you so much for being with us today to share it with us.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
You're currently listening to Dialogue on Illinois Soul, and right now you just heard from Brian Mackey and Johannes LaCour. We're continuing this conversation with the Invisible Institute after this short break. Stay with us on Dialogue on Illinois Soul. From Illinois Soul, this is Dialogue. I'm Kennedy Vincent. Dialogue is an exchange about culture, straight from the soul. You can catch us on Saturday mornings at 11 and Tuesdays at 7 p.m. on Illinois Soul. You're currently listening to Illinois Public Media's The 21st Show. They've been speaking with the Invisible Institute and all of the work they've been doing. Right now, you're tuning into another segment on the Invisible Institute and how they highlight in which ways reporters there can partner with local journalism outlets to explore more data and investigate capacity that a smaller newsroom might not have on its own. In this case, the partner organization was our producing station, Illinois Public Media in Urbana. One of several pieces to come out of this partnership was titled Champaign Police Investigate Agency Culture of Not Following Domestic Violence Reporting Laws. You're going to hear from Farah Anderson. Back then, she was a journalism student at the University of Illinois. And Diane Lean, a graduate student in journalism at Northwestern's Medill School. Let's listen to an excerpt from the story. This is Champaign resident Rita Connerly describing a time when she called to complain that her former partner was outside of her home with a gift for their daughter.
All that he did when he first responded is say, well, hey, he's just coming over here to bring a gift. Don't you want this gift? No, you can put it in here. Like, no, we don't want it. She doesn't want it.
After only 4 minutes, Christensen left without investigating any further. He did not file a report. Connerly says Officer Christensen's lack of action made her feel unsafe, just like her abuser had done.
Because as a person who has previously been a victim of his, in that moment, again, feeling like a victim.
The officer was later found to have violated department rules, and the report shows it was not an isolated incident. The story went on to be recognized with a regional award from the Society of Professional Journalists and took second place in collaborative effort from the Public Media Journalists Association. Now graduated from the U of I, Farah Anderson is still reporting for Illinois Public Media and working in an internship with the Investigative Reporting Workshop in Washington, D.C. Also joining the conversation is Sam Stecklow, a journalist, editor, and Freedom of Information Act guru with the Invisible Institute, which partnered with Illinois Public Media on this and many other stories. We will now tune into this conversation with the 21st Show.
Farah, let's start with you. How did these investigations into the Champaign Police Department come about? How did you get put on this story?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got put on the story by, how every journalist gets put on a story by DMing somebody on Twitter. So I was really interested in working with Invisible Institute, especially in my capacity at IPM. So of course I just DM'd Sam on Twitter and kind of started picking up some stories that needed to be finished up. And this was one of the stories that I got assigned. And basically we were just kind of updating some reporting that had already been done by co-reporter Diana Lean, and looking at, how was the department doing after a lot of these investigations and, after a lot of this follow-up. And we found that, the only retraining they had done after a lot of violations of the Illinois Domestic Violence Reporting Act was just a 10-question multiple choice online test. And we got that through public records requests and just looking at kind of what the department was doing after this. And so that's kind of how I came on talking to survivors of domestic violence and looking at kind of how these policies and how these retrainings kind of impact the culture at the Champaign Police Department of following domestic violence laws.
Yeah, well, and
so
maybe
that
we
was
can
kind of
take
how I came on to that.
Sure, and let's maybe even take a step back and say before, this retraining, your investigation documented what former Champaign Police Chief, then Chief Anthony Cobb, called a concern of systematic or agency culture of not complying with the Illinois Domestic Violence Act. What did that mean in practice? What were officers not doing?
Yeah, so we found that lots of officers were going out to calls where people had called alleging domestic violence incidents, and they weren't filling out reports. And that has a lot of implications for survivors of domestic violence. For survivors, having a paper trail of reports of, saying, hey, I called the police, they came out, and an officer took a report and this is what happened, also kind of helps them get orders of protection or restraining orders against their abusers. And so not having that paper trail is really devastating to a lot of survivors of domestic violence. So we were looking at specific cases where Champaign police officers were going out to these calls and they weren't documenting that. So it was really hard for survivors to later get orders of protection and, had issues down the line. So like you noted, the former police chief had noted that this was, a systemic issue within the department. And the only thing they did was this 10-question retraining. And then that was it. And we talked to experts that said that, this isn't enough. When you have a systemic issue with something like this, especially as devastating as this, you need more systemic retraining, and just a 10-question online questionnaire is not what officers need. They need more, advanced training on how to respond to these calls, the right questions to ask, and kind of what the follow-up needs to look like in these cases to protect survivors from further incidents and for them to establish that paper trail so that they can get to safety later on.
Sam Stecklow, I want to bring you into the conversation now. As we heard earlier, the Invisible Institute grew out of Jamie Kelvin's lawsuit and other work he'd done, but his really the sort of one of the big impetus was this lawsuit that opened up all this Chicago police data. How does an investigation of Champaign police, how does that fit into the context of the broader mission of what the Invisible Institute is doing?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So after we won this decision, Calvin versus Chicago in 2014, and spent a few years working with the city or working against the city sometimes to get all of the data underlying all of the police misconduct complaints that were made public by the decision, also working against the FOP throughout that. There was a different decision that they prompted, which also found that these records should be made public or should remain public. And so we built this database, the Citizens Police Data Project. You can go to at cpdp.co. And after we were running that website for a few years and seeing the impact, we realized that, of course, police misconduct does not end at Chicago, city borders. There are officers who leave the CPD, and we saw that happening and going to other agencies, but we also knew that there were real serious issues of police misconduct elsewhere in Illinois, and those cities, like Chicago, were impacted by this decision, but perhaps it was not being enforced in the same way because news organizations may not have had the resources to take that appellate court decision and really apply it to their own police departments. And so that's something that we started doing. We started having conversations with partner news organizations, looking at reporting that had been done. So we started talking with IPM and CU Citizen Access in Champaign, began reporting stories out, and then met Farah, and she came on and was kind of a beat reporter for us between Invisible Institute and IPM for the last year. And so we really see that as our mission of expanding the ability of news organizations to do this kind of reporting outside of Chicago, because we certainly can't do it alone. We don't intend to do it alone. And these are stories that need to be told in every community by people in those communities.
Sam, you do a lot of work around the Freedom of Information Act, and it might surprise some people to hear that in a lot of cases it's not actually easy or even really free to pry the people's data from the people's government. Talk about what goes into that work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the first thing is really knowing what your rights are with regards to being able to access data for a very long time. There had been other court decisions that had talked about, some kind of access to police misconduct records in Illinois, but there had been nothing that really crystallized that access and that freedom of access until the Calvin decision, which was something that we brought strategically as a goal to be able to get at the underlying data that we knew existed at the Chicago Police Department and what was at that time the Independent Police Review Authority. And so being able to kind of understand the systems where information is kept, and then that is, a resource intensive and research intensive process. And then that process of litigation was, the result of ultimately about 10 years of litigation to get to the Calvin versus Chicago appellate court decision, and more years to, get the data, process the data, publish the data, and now it's a process to keep the data published or maintained. And so those are all incredibly resource intensive. I can't give you a number, but the Champaign process as well, we didn't get as much resistance from the Champaign or Urbana police departments when we were trying to access data for our Champaign area data tool, which is champaign.cpdp.co is the URL. But what we did get is data that was pretty messy because these were smaller police departments that had not had the resources to have the kind of more complex data systems that the CPD had, or had not prioritized that in the same way, certainly. And so that was a separate kind of process of, okay, how do we take these very disparate kind of files and go from that into something that we can present to the public as, well, you can now look up police misconduct data in Champaign County, which was not, not as simple a proposition, right? But in a very different way.
Farah, what sort of responses have you gotten from either the Champaign Police Department and just the community in general since publication of this work?
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of, responses from people, even public officials who say, this work was something that was just not really being published before this collaboration. So I think that's been really exciting. This is just work in general that we just haven't really seen. So I think that that's just something that, is kind of unprecedented here in Champaign County. We've also published some other stories outside of just Champaign and Urbana. We've published some stories focusing on the Rantoul Police Department, and especially from, the community in Rantoul, which is obviously a much smaller town, looking at, these are stories that they had never seen published before. The Rantoul Police Department had never really gotten, investigative journalists looking into them. They didn't even really have a very formal FOIA request process set up. So I think, a lot of these stories are stories that have really gone untold. And I think that really, feeds into our mission of, partnering with local journalists like me, and then using some of the, investigative skills that Invisible Institute has to create reporting that hasn't been done before and really holds power to account in a lot of these smaller communities, which just hasn't been happening. So the response has been really good, and we're excited about some additional investigative stories we will have coming out soon about the Urbana Police Department. And we just have to keep continuing doing this work and, holding police departments accountable for their actions.
Sam, just less than a minute left, and I'm going to hold you to it. But this is a time when local journalism has really been shrunk by corporate consolidation, extractive social media companies, and even just changing reader tastes. What does that mean for the work of the Invisible Institute in places where there are fewer and fewer local journalists to partner with?
I think it means that it's really important for us to partner with people who have an interest in doing that journalism and who may not be within a formal structure. And so whether that is people who might be in a journalism school or people at, for example, university that doesn't have as formal a journalism program. We've been working with folks at Governor State University's Center for Community Media, where they've been building up a journalism program. But we've been trying to really meet communities where they're at and see what resources we can bring to make sure that that gap is met. But it's a very, very difficult challenge to obviously face all the consolidation and cuts that you just mentioned.
You are listening to a conversation from Illinois Public Media's The 21st Show. They were speaking with the Invisible Institute located in Chicago and dissecting all of the different projects they have going on. They surround their work with investigative reporting, multimedia storytelling, human rights documentation, and much more. The 21st Show is produced by Christine Hatfield, Jose Zepeda, and Brian Mackey. You're currently listening to Dialogue on Illinois Soul. Dialogue's executive producers are Needhi Shastri and myself, Kennedy Vincent. Our news and public affairs director is Reginald Hardwick, and production assistance by Steve Mork. Dialogue's theme song is by Lamont Holden. Dialogue is a part of Illinois Soul and Illinois Public Media. Join us for our next Dialogue, Saturday mornings at 11 and Tuesdays at 7 p.m. on Illinois Soul, and Wednesdays at 8 p.m. on AM 580.